B. Nope, absolutely not. The Troupe will get crushed like bugs by bugs. Whereas after having thought about it, I think it might actually be the other way around. Diving into the Troupe actually reveals some pretty terrifying possibilities. The most terrifying of which is obviously the prospect of subscribing to the New World Review, which will have the side effect.
Hello everybody, it's Prolly again, back again, talking about more Hunter x Hunter for the first time in like 4 months now. Today, we're going to be talking about a pretty popular topic here on YouTube, that being the Phantom Troupe versus the Royal Guard. I've had this script floating around and in progress for a few months now, and I think it's a pretty educational topic to explain many things in the series. Normally I would explain both sides before dropping my conclusion and going into the match, but instead I'm mainly going to be explaining why the Royal Guard would actually obliterate the Troupe with pretty much zero difficulty from the get-go. Seeing as I've made a video centered on the Phantom Troupe, which I still consider to be a decent analysis, some of my opinions have changed, I'll just briefly go over the Troupe and give them the benefit of the doubt for the most part to see where they would scale. While there is a significant range in compatibility from the top and the bottom of the Phantom Troupe, generally you could scale many Phantom Troupe members to the level of Chimera Ant officers and squadron leaders with a little bit of generosity, which we'll be granting them for the sake of argument. Pakunoda and Troupe are pretty featless and are both at the bottom of the Phantom Troupe's strength ranking. Pakunoda getting wounded and beat up by God and Killua when she was caught off guard, and Troupe having pretty much zero feats at all. However, he is somewhat confident he can hold off Finks and Phaeton alongside Machi. Shalnark, Finks, Bonolenov, Kaluto, and Shizuku are all capable of pretty much manhandling officer-class ants. When using his last resort, Shalnark obliterates the officer ant he faces and even shocks it with the amount of aura he has, even though this officer should know the other squadron leaders and officers. Kaluto more or less folds the ant he faces, though thinks Zazan and Phaeton are far beyond him. Shizuku is pretty relative to Pike in combat, and as she was forced to outsmart him to win and couldn't really stomp him with just raw power and speed. Finks' normal punches were completely ineffective against the ant he was facing. However, with his ability he could one-shot it and was fairly confident he could handle Zazan when Phaeton was being physically overwhelmed, something Bonolenov was also pretty confident in. Phaeton was able to somewhat duke it out with Zazan before she transforms, even when he's rusty. After she transforms, however, she tanks a co-enhanced sword strike from Phaeton with no damage, and he uses his Pain Packer attack, which forces all the other Troupe members around to run away and kills Zazan. This ability is also based off the damage Phaeton tanks, meaning it's not solely dependent on Phaeton's own power, but rather the power of his opponent. Nobunaga and Machi are implied to be around Hisoka's level by Killua, and are somewhat confident they can also fight Hisoka. Nobunaga is also able to keep up in combat with Uvogin, and is generally considered part of their main fighting force, including Finks and Phaeton. He's also confident he could stop Finks from going after Kurapika. Machi herself being somewhat interesting to Hisoka, as well as being confident she could beat him if Hisoka was stronger than Chrollo. She, alongside Troupe, were also going to try and stop Phaeton and Finks. Franklin is also likely comparable to Nobunaga, as the two briefly clashed during the York New arc, and Franklin was confident he could handle Hisoka if Hisoka came after him. Uvogin is considered the physically strongest, and Chrollo even thinks it's virtually impossible to stop him unless you have some sort of complex ability or strategy. This is pretty impressive, seeing as Chrollo has physical feats against Zeno and Silva. That evidently brings us to Chrollo, who in the data books is generally considered a 4 out of 5 level combatant, above even Zazan and other squadron leaders like Leol and Chitu. The data book says he's the strongest member of the Troupe, Machi also believing he could handle Hisoka. The data book also compare his overall combat ability to Zeno and Silva. Zeno is considered vaguely impressive by P2 to the point that she actively tries to fight him, and Netero thought he'd be useful during the palace invasion despite knowing about the Royal Guard. Hisoka would scale around here as well, as obviously he could contend with Chrollo physically in both power and speed, if not Hisoka having a distinct advantage and Chrollo just having a skill and versatility advantage. Hisoka is also a 4 out of 5 combatant in the data books. It's pretty safe to say they are pretty relative. Illumi also falls under this category, as well as Hisoka finds him interesting enough to want to fight, and ranks Illumi above the Zodiacs. The Zodiacs are all essentially the Association's top hunters, even considered above Morel and Nav that Netero specifically chooses to be his sparring partners. Now that we've gone over the troupe, let's just give a brief synopsis to where they scale again. Cortopi and Pakunoda have pretty much no scaling at all, unless you want to take that Cortopi to Finks and Phaeton shit. Shizuku and Kaluto scaling somewhat to officer ants, with Kaluto distinctly being weaker than Zazan. Finks, Nobunaga, Bonolenov, Machi, Last Resort Shalnark, and possibly Franklin all scaling to squadron leaders, and possibly a vague level of Hisoka. Phaeton being distinctly above Zazan with Painpacker and capable of killing most of the others below him with it. Prolly, Hisoka, and likely Illumi being generally considered beyond squadron leader tier, with Uvogan surpassing them physically. I'm not saying I agree with this, I just want to make that very clear, but we're granting the troupe the benefit of the doubt to help illustrate the gap between them and the ants. While the troupe are all considered some of the strongest humans in the verse, Togashi drawing them with this aura of elitism and power, it's generally agreed upon by most people in the fanbase that Prolly, Hisoka, and Illumi are all top tiers among them. This is especially important due to them scaling below Netero and P2. Netero, without even his full abilities, is considered extremely impressive. Despite being rusty and not serious in the slightest, Hisoka thought he was impressive enough to challenge, while Netero, despite seeking worthy opponents, was indifferent towards Hisoka and not at all interested. He's also able to solo entire squadrons of Chimera Ants on his own, including their officers. Remember now, it was just Zazan's squadron that was giving 6 members of the troupe tons of trouble, and here's Netero pretty much swatting dozens of squadron, no problem. Imagine if, like, instead of Phaeton and all those other guys, like, Netero, like, rusty old beard Netero, just pulled up to Meteor City. He'd probably literally, like, just step on Zazan and all her officers. Zeno also thinks Netero is his far superior, and even before P2 knew about the Guanyin, thought base Netero was a greater threat than Zeno or his Dragon Dive technique. This is pretty insane. As we went over earlier, Zeno was somewhat comparable to Prolly in combat, and the databook stats even say they are equal, with Prolly conceding an aura-focused jab from Zeno is beyond his aura defenses. Netero then regains his groove and gets truly serious, powering up his aura, which even impresses Morel and Nav, who believe he's the strongest hunter alive so far. Even Illumi, who thinks he could murder Hisoka if he wanted, thinks very highly of Netero. Netero also having a perfect 5 out of 5 in every databook stat, as well as everything we just went over. It's pretty apparent both narratively and scaling wise, Netero is considered to be a next level being beyond any hunter or human, and should directly scale above Hisoka and Prolly. Despite this, Colt believes base Netero would take the L to any squadron leader, including Shiapoof, whose physical strength tends to get downplayed because he has noodles for arms. Netero, even after training more, can't damage Pito with his Guanyin attack, and the Royals all being considered relative in the databooks, and P2 having a slight advantage as Meruem's top soldier. Netero even thinks P2 would beat him upon first seeing him, which Morel and Nav then doubt the abilities of anyone else to stop P2, including Jing Freaks, the Zodiacs themselves, and every other hunter they know about. This should kinda put into perspective the gap we are dealing with here. Netero, despite far surpassing both Prolly and Hisoka, is only barely scratching those Royal Guard levels, if at all, and it's really only because of his insane speed. Even newborn P2, with no abilities or training, is able to rip off Kite's arm and proceed to obliterate him with almost no damage. Kite, much like Prolly and Hisoka, has a 4 out of 5 Nen and body stats in the databook and can off-screen squadron leaders with little difficulty. He's likely considered to be on that peak human tier alongside Prolly and Hisoka. Killua also thinks that this P2 is scarier than Illumi and Hisoka, with the volume statement calling P2 the strongest opponent they faced, which includes Razor, Genthru, Hisoka, and most of the troupe. This is again supported by P2's own stats, which are 5 out of 5 in the databook. The same goes for Yuppie and Shiapoof. Yes, even Poof's noodle arm ass has a 5 out of 5 in body and nen. Many of the lesser troop members also only really cap at the squadron leader tier or maybe a little higher, and all the squadron leaders pretty much openly concede inferiority to the royals. Morel states that while squadron leaders and officers wouldn't even be able to scratch Merom, the guards simply would not harm him out of loyalty. Not saying that they can't harm him, just that they wouldn't. These squadron leaders are also probably more powerful than Zazan, having been trained in Nen combat by Poof and P2, yet still concede inferiority to Poof and P2. P2 was also just bruised by a slap from Merom's tail, the same slap that killed 2 squadron leaders just prior to this. Killua, who could one-shot officer ants like Ramot and has stats in the 4 out of 5 range, much like Crollo and Hisoka, further amped by Godspeed, couldn't even damage Yuppie and was considered less than 1/10 of Yuppie's strength. The same goes for Morel and Knuckle, who were able to brawl with squadron leaders even physically. Knuckle in particular took a beating from Chitu with pretty much no damage, but thought that a single blast from Yuppie would instantly kill him. I think by now I've made it painfully apparent that even the very best of the Phantom Troop are falling behind the Royal Guard by a significant margin. Phaeton, who's considered by fans to be one of the strongest members, couldn't even damage Zazan with a Ko-enhanced sword strike. Ko, for those who forgot, is literally focusing all of your aura into a single point. This means in actual combat there is quite literally nothing Phaeton can do to even harm a single member of the Royal Guard. Remember now, Zazan is a squadron leader, the same tier of ants that Merom was one-shotting with his tail. Yet these tail slaps could barely even bruise P2. This means that Phaeton's sword attacks literally cannot do anything to P2 or the other Royal Guard, and the fact that it even literally bounced off Zazan makes this very apparent. Finks and Bona Lenov are in an even worse situation, as Fink's normal punches and Bona Lenov's prologue ability did no damage to an officer ant. Without their Hatsu, which they require conditions and charge times to activate, they are absolutely useless against the Royals. And again, these 3 are generally considered to be among the stronger members in the troop, and Finks and Phaeton are also considered part of their combat squad, so this means the non-combative members like Machi and Shizuku are in an even worse boat against the Royals. The only people who can really box against the Royals in this situation and hold their own are going to be Crollo, Hisoka, Uvogan, and maybe Illumi. Crollo and Hisoka both scale to Zeno, who P2 considers vaguely impressive. Illumi scales above Morel, who with strategy can somewhat fight the Royals, and Uvogan scales above Crollo physically. So it's going to be more like those 4 against the Guard, and I already explained why Netero is above all 4 of them, and we know Netero doesn't even think he can beat the Guard. What a lot of the more casual Hunter x Hunter fans will then say is, But Mr. Fiction, the Phantom Troop has skills and abilities. You're not considering their skills and abilities, Mr. Fiction. You've been debunked. And while it's a bit of a meme among the Hunter x Hunter scaling community, the Phantom Troop's abilities just aren't really that special. I'd like you to consider for a moment what a lot of the troop's skills really are. Finks' Hatsu is a really strong punch. Kaluto's ability is really strong paper. Bona Lenov's ability is a big explosion. Franklin shoots bullets. The point I'm trying to get across here is a lot of the Phantom Troop's abilities are simply cool ways of hitting very, very hard, and aren't really useful if you're facing someone massively more powerful than you are. But I guess I should go over most of them regardless, because there are a few interesting ones. Machi's threads could make for a useful healing ability if it weren't for the fact that pretty much everyone gets one shot here. The only ones that possibly don't get one shot would be Hisoka, Crollo, Uvogan, and maybe Illumi if you give him the benefit of the doubt. However, the only way Machi would even have time to heal them would be if everyone else were to throw themselves at the guard to stall them and instantly get one shot. Finks' Ripper Cyclodron is extremely unquantifiable. All we can really say is with it he thinks he could take down Zazan. Even Gon, who could body Officer Ants in base and has massive potential, after making a contract worse than death and a John Ken which amps himself by 10 times over, could not kill Pito with a single attack. So it's an extreme stretch to say Finks could do just about anything before any of the guard could kill him. Shalnark's manipulator ability is somewhat viable, however there are a few problems. Shalnark is extremely weak in base to the point he's tagged and pinned by a Peon class Ant, which are stated to be so weak squadron leaders can one-shot them. He even questions if he can pierce the Peon's shell, let alone Yuppie with an aura surpassing Morel 10 times over. Illumi might actually be able to land his attack, which is also a manipulator ability. However, it's questionable if it would even penetrate their skin, and even if it did, his needles have only been shown working on normal humans. He's never used them on people like Hisoka. The only time he's used them on an at all impressive character, that being Killua, it only slightly alters his perception and mindset, let alone someone like Yuppie, who was far surpassing and even more powerful Killua. So it's very unlikely to say Illumi's ability would even affect them. Phaeton's Pain Packer falls under a similar argument as Finks. To say he'd even be able to activate it, he'd need to actually survive attacks from the guard and not just get instantly murked. Even Zazan could pressure Phaeton when he was at full power, so surely P2 or Poof could take him down. It's definitely one of the better win cons for the Troupe, but it still does absolutely nothing here. All of his abilities, the other Troupe members backing him up, and his insane planning, then just know how threatening Prolly is to them, with P2 having a supernatural perception to understand the threat level of her opponents, such as with Gon and Netero, and Poof being able to cast Spiritual Message and read Crollo's mind. There's absolutely no way Crollo's pulling off any shenanigans against those two. The rest of the Troupe's abilities are completely useless. Franklin's f***ing bullets are not hurting Yuppie. I don't care what you think. A lot of these stereotypical normie YouTube channels will say stuff like, well, we don't know what abilities all the Troupe members have, so maybe they have some crazy ability, who knows? Which is completely an argument from ignorance, is completely fallacious. Like, sure, maybe Bonolenov can turn into a fighter jet and rain missiles down onto the Royal Guard, but this isn't an episode of Game Theory, so we're not going to be making crazy assumptions like that. Even a squad of Morel, Knuckle, Shoot, and Killua, with support from Melioron, all extremely skilled and powerful hunters with advanced abilities and experience, couldn't do anything against Yuppie or P2 with all their teamwork. Killua, who also has similar stats to Crollo and Hisoka in the databooks, even while further amped by Godspeed, was less than 1/10 of Yuppie's raw power. Killua, with years worth of training and experience, insane hand-to-hand skill with one of the most busted and advanced net abilities we've seen in the verse so far, could not take down Yuppie. Poof and P2 are also extremely skilled, especially Poof, who could instantly paralyze and read all of their minds with his scales, or split into microscopic versions of himself, which none of them have the ability to counter except maybe Phaeton. On top of that, he's extremely intelligent and can rival Morel in IQ, with a perfect 5 out of 5 in databook intelligence stats, something even Crollo, who is renowned for his intellect, does not possess. P2 has pretty advanced net abilities herself that she could develop in mere days, such as Terpscora, which amps her already impressive stats even further. She could also turn puppets out of any of the dead Troupe members, her kite puppet being strong enough to give Shoot and Knuckle a hard time. It's also possible most of the Troupe would simply freeze in fear just by feeling Pito's N, like what happened with Nalv. To really hammer home this skill and experience overcome all argument, let's just go over Netero one more time.
Netero, 46 years old, winter. Sensing that he had reached the upper limits of his physical and martial arts skills, He pondered and reflected, and he realized that he was grateful.
Netero, despite having one of the most versatile and insane Hatsu in the series, with near infinite attack options, having trained for decades to reach the pinnacle of martial arts and strength, and constantly seeking worthy foes, the Grand Master of Shigen Rien Kung Fu with an insane IQ that can predict the Chimera Ant battle strategy and even morale. So advanced, Zeno Zoldyck thought he was impossible to read despite intellectually reading Prolly like a book. Despite Netero having all of this, as well as being the strongest and fastest hunter we've seen so far, including Prolly and Hisoka, thought he'd take the L to P2. The strongest, fastest, smartest, and most skilled character with more experience than anybody thought he would still lose to P2. So sorry, but I don't think Finks twirling his arm a little bit is going to do anything to P2. In conclusion, the Royal Guard stomped due to massively superior stats. The only real win-cons the Troupe has come from Prolly, and unfortunately, he's still significantly weaker than any of the Royal Guard. The fact that Netero, who while rusty and in base, could probably slap Phaeton, Finks, Bonolenov, Kaluto, Shalnark, and Shizuku at the same time, and is stronger than Prolly and Hisoka, couldn't stand up to the Guard even after training is extremely telling how this match would go. It's possible even individual members of the Guard could solo the Troupe, but I will not grandstand that now. For now, until the Troupe does some crazy stuff in the manga, the Guard destroy them pretty badly.